Inside the opulent museums displaying Viking longships and golden artifacts, there is a terrifying silence regarding the true source of that wealth. Have you ever heard of the architecture of suffering, a system meticulously designed to turn women into speaking tools, breathing toys, and walking sacrifices? Do not let the movies fool you. This is not a heroic legend. This is the true story of 500,000 women who were erased from history. Inside a tent on the banks of the Volga River, 6 warriors wait in the shadow. The year is 922. The girl entering knows what comes next, because she has watched this ceremony before, though never from this position. Her name is Sigrid, though the Arab chronicler watching through the tent fabric will never record that name. He will write only that she was young, that she had served the dead chieftain, and that she had volunteered to follow him into the afterlife. The 3rd warrior has just finished. The 4th approaches. Sigrid speaks in broken Norse words she learned during 2 years of captivity since her Slavic village burned. "I see my master," she says to no one and to everyone. She speaks to the old woman called the Angel of Death, who stands in the corner heating a blade over coals. He calls me to his hall. The 4th warrior does not care about her visions. Neither does the 5th. By the time the 6th is done, Sigrid no longer speaks of seeing anything. The Angel of Death approaches with the rope and the blade, one for strangling, one for certainty. The crowd outside begins singing louder to cover any sounds that might escape the tent. In 10 minutes, Sigrid will burn on the funeral ship beside the chieftain who owned her. She will become smoke memory, and then nothing. But Sigrid was lucky. She knew when her suffering would end. She could count the minutes until release. Most captured women entered a system designed to make them pray for death that would never come. What the Vikings created was not simple slavery, but an architecture of female suffering so elaborate that Arab chroniclers, Byzantine historians, and European monks all agreed they had witnessed something unprecedented in human cruelty. This is the story they tried to forget. Sister Ethelred pressed herself deeper into the grain storage as Norse voices grew closer. June 8th, 793. The holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northumbria. An hour ago, she had been copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. Now she crouched in darkness, grain dust filling her lungs, listening to sounds she had never imagined inside monastery walls. Through cracks in the wooden building, she watched warriors sorting the captured. Her friend Bridget was dragged by her hair toward the beach where strange ships waited. Bridget had been beautiful with auburn hair that caught the sunlight during morning prayers. That beauty had become her curse. The Vikings separated women into groups with the efficiency of farmers sorting livestock. Young and beautiful in one group, older but strong in another. The elderly and the sick received quick deaths. Their bodies were left where they fell. A hand plunged into the grain beside her. Fingers found her arm. The warrior who pulled her out had blue eyes and smelled of salt and blood. He said something in his language, then shoved her toward the growing line of captives. Sister Ethelred, who had devoted her life to Christ at age 14, who had spent 12 years in peaceful contemplation, was about to discover what Vikings did to the women they captured. The ship journey redefined suffering. 40 women crowded into a space meant for 20. No food for the first 2 days. Water only when waves crashed over the side, leaving them to lick salt moisture from wood that countless previous captives had also licked. The women were organized by their potential value, and even in the darkness below deck, the warriors knew exactly which ones had been selected for which purposes. Ethelred learned to recognize the different types of visits. Sometimes warriors came for violence, sometimes for other things, sometimes just to look to evaluate their shares of the coming division. The journey from Lindisfarne to Norway took 11 days. By the 5th day, 2 women had died. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony. By the 8th day, Ethelred had stopped praying. God seemed very far from this wooden tomb sliding across dark water. When they reached Norway, the division began immediately. The raid leader claimed first choice, selecting 6 women including Bridget. His warriors chose next by order of reputation and valor shown in battle. Ethelred went to a farmer named Gunnar, who needed field workers. She watched Bridget led away toward the chieftain's hall, and thought her friend's fate must be better. She was wrong. 20 years later, Ethelred would die in Norway, her hands destroyed by decades of grinding grain, her back permanently bent from carrying impossible loads. She never learned what happened to Bridget initially, though she heard rumors through the elaborate networks that enslaved women developed. Bridget had lasted 3 months in the chieftain's hall before being sold to a trader heading east. From there, she vanished into the vast Viking slave networks that stretched from Iceland to Constantinople. The night Lindisfarne fell was not unique. It was the template for 3 centuries of raids that would transform Northern Europe. Every monastery, every village, every isolated farm faced the same possibility. The ships could appear any dawn, and when they did, the women knew their lives as human beings were over. But Bridget was beautiful, and beauty in Viking captivity was a curse beyond imagination. The morning after a successful raid on a Frankish village chieftain, Ragnar Ironhand, walked slowly between rows of captured women. 200 women knelt in the mud of the temporary camp, their homes still smoking in the distance. Ragnar carried a staff that he used to lift chins, turn faces toward the light, inspect his new property. He separated them into 3 categories with practiced efficiency. Group 1, laborers. This included older women and those showing signs of hard living. They would work fields, grind grain, and maintain households until their bodies failed. Group 2, breeders. This consisted of healthy young women of childbearing age. They would produce more slaves, their children automatically inheriting their mother's status. Group 3 marked for special purposes. This included the beautiful, the noble, and the very young. Marie was 30, a mother of 4, who had watched Vikings cut down her husband in their doorway. She went to the laborer group. Her hands showed she knew how to work, and her sturdy build suggested years of productive labor remained. She would spend 16 hours a day grinding grain in Ragnar's household, her fingers gradually deforming from the repetitive motion until they looked like twisted roots. 8 years she would last before her body simply stopped functioning, worn out like a tool used past breaking. Isabel was 16, daughter of a minor nobleman who had tried to organize resistance. She went to the breeder group. Within a month, she would understand what that categorization meant. Within a year, she would give birth to her first child, a boy who would never know his father's name. Over the next decade, she would produce 7 children, all born into slavery, all separated from her as soon as they could work. The Viking economy ran on this multiplication of human property. Marguerite possessed the kind of beauty that transcended circumstances. 20 years old with features that remained striking even through tears and mud, she went to the Special Purposes Group. Her fate diverged from the others immediately. While Marie and Isabel would remain in Scandinavia, Marguerite would be cleaned, fed better food, taught basic phrases in multiple languages. She was an investment being prepared for sale to the highest bidder in the great slave markets of the East. This selection process revealed the economic precision underlying Viking raids. This was not random violence, but calculated harvesting. Each category of woman had specific market values and designated purposes within the elaborate machinery of Norse slavery. The Vikings had industrialized human suffering with an efficiency that would not be matched until the Atlantic slave trade 7 centuries later. Ragnar's selections that morning were replicated across hundreds of raids each year. Vikings developed expertise in evaluating human property instantly. They could determine a woman's approximate age by her teeth, her capacity for work by her hands, her breeding potential by her hips. They knew which ethnicities commanded premium prices in which markets. Frankish women brought good prices in Ireland. Irish women were valued in Iceland. Slavic women commanded the highest prices in Byzantine markets. The economic calculations went deeper. A woman who could weave was worth 3 times one who couldn't. A woman who could read and write, especially in Latin, might be sold to Byzantine households seeking educated servants. A woman with knowledge of herbs and healing could serve Viking households in multiple capacities. Every skill increased value. Every capability meant extended survival, though survival itself became a questionable blessing. Marie discovered her fate that first day when she was brought to the grinding stones, 2 massive circular stones, one atop the other, with a wooden handle that required constant rotation. Grain poured in from above, flour emerged from below, and the woman turning the handle existed only to maintain this transformation. The woman she replaced had died the previous day, her heart giving out after 7 years of the same motion. Marie took her position and began to push. The stones were heavy. The work was endless. Her hands started bleeding within hours. Isabel learned her designation's meaning when she was brought to a separate building where other young women lived. They explained the reality in whispers. She would be bred like livestock. The children would not be hers to raise. Resistance meant punishment that stopped just short of damaging her reproductive capacity. Acceptance meant survival, though survival in this context required redefining the word entirely. Marguerite's preparation began immediately. She was bathed, her hair arranged in styles that emphasized her features. She was taught to stand in ways that displayed her figure advantageously. She learned basic phrases in Arabic, Greek, and Slavonic. Every day traders would visit to inspect her, though actual sale awaited arrival at a major market. She was merchandise being prepared for display, and the better she presented, the higher her price would climb. But survival was not measured in years. It was measured in how many times you could be broken before staying broken. The auction block in Dublin stood 15 feet high, ensuring visibility for the hundreds of buyers crowding the market square. The year was 852, and Dublin had transformed from an Irish settlement into the Vikings' western headquarters for human trafficking. Princess Orlith stood naked on the platform, her royal lineage now merely a selling point to increase her price. The auctioneer spoke in 4 languages describing her qualities to Byzantine merchants, Moorish traders from Spain, Norse settlers from Iceland, and local Irish collaborators who profited from the suffering of their own people. He emphasized her nobility, education, and virginity, though the last was assumption rather than verified fact. verification would lower the price by suggesting damage to the merchandise. Bidding started at 12 marks of silver. A Byzantine merchant raised it to 15, knowing that an Irish princess would command attention in Constantinople slave markets. An Icelandic settler countered with 18, needing women for his expanding household. The final price reached 24 marks, paid by a trader who specialized in moving high-value women along the eastern routes. Orlaith would travel through Sweden down Russian rivers and eventually reach Baghdad, where her white skin and red hair would make her an exotic curiosity in some wealthy merchant's household. But Orlaith's sale was just one transaction in a market that processed thousands of women monthly. Dublin's slave infrastructure rivaled Rome's ancient markets in scale and exceeded them in efficiency. Holding pens could maintain 500 women at a time. Feeding stations provided minimal sustenance to preserve value without excessive cost. Medical inspectors ensured that sick women were isolated to prevent epidemics that might destroy inventory. The Welsh girl called Branwen had been sold 16 times in 2 years. Each sale moved her farther from home through different Viking settlements, where she served briefly before being resold. The constant movement was deliberate. Women who stayed in one place too long might develop connections, might organize resistance, might become human to their owners. The trade kept them in motion, perpetually displaced, forever foreign. In the holding pens, a Pictish woman gave birth on straw that hadn't been changed in weeks. The baby would be raised to slavery if it survived, though infant mortality in the pens exceeded 60%. The mother would be given 3 days to recover before returning to the auction block. Her recent pregnancy was advertised as proof of fertility. Buyers appreciated confirmation that their investments could multiply themselves. A Frankish noblewoman named Elisenda attempted to buy her own freedom, offering information about hidden gold in her family's estates. The traders listened to her information, sent men to retrieve the gold, then sold her anyway. The concept of honor in dealings with slaves was considered absurd. They were property, and property could not make deals. The price variations revealed the precise commodification of female humanity. A virgin between 14 and 18 might bring 20 marks. The same woman no longer virgin dropped to 12 marks. A woman over 25 brought 8 marks if she showed no specialized skills. A woman over 35 brought 4 marks unless she possessed exceptional abilities. A pregnant woman might bring 15 marks with the understanding that she carried potential additional property. Skills created premium categories. A woman who could illuminate manuscripts might bring 30 marks from monasteries seeking to continue their work despite lacking trained monks. A woman with medical knowledge might bring 40 marks from settlements needing healers. Musical ability, particularly singing, could double a woman's value for wealthy households seeking entertainment. 3 ships arrived weekly during trading season, each carrying 30 to 60 women gathered from raids across the Christian world. The logistics required extraordinary coordination, food and water for the journey's security to prevent escapes, medical knowledge to minimize losses, and extensive networks to identify buyers. The Vikings had created the medieval world's most sophisticated human trafficking system. One shipment of 30 women from Francia to Iceland demonstrates the trade's brutal mathematics. 2 women jumped overboard on the 3rd day, preferring drowning to whatever awaited them. 5 died during the journey from disease, violence, or despair. The remaining 23 were distributed among Icelandic settlers who had placed orders in advance. Each woman represented a specific request: young for breeding, old for field work, beautiful for status display, skilled for specialized labor. The woman who jumped overboard left behind a daughter in the ship's hold. The child, perhaps 7 years old, watched her mother choose death over slavery. She would remember that choice for the rest of her life in Iceland, where she would grow up as property, have children as property, and die as property on an island where the oceans stretched endlessly in all directions. Freedom always visible, but forever unreachable. Those sold to Iceland faced a unique horror. They were entering an island prison where escape meant freezing death in endless ocean. At the Althing, Iceland's General Assembly at Thingvellir in the year 970, the law speaker stood on the rock platform and recited from memory the section of Graga's law concerning female thralls. His voice carried across the gathered crowd as he spoke words that had been refined over generations to completely erase female humanity within legal frameworks. A thrall woman's body belongs entirely to her master. She cannot refuse any use of her person. Her children belong to her master. She cannot own property. She cannot bear witness. She cannot seek compensation for any harm. She exists outside law, except as her master's possession. These were not abstractions, but daily realities for thousands of women across the Norse world. The law created a state of living death where women existed physically, but had no legal existence as persons. They were animate property-breathing objects, conscious possessions, with no more rights than furniture or livestock. The case being tried that day illustrated the system perfectly. Thorstein Redbeard had killed his neighbor's female thrall named Asa during a dispute over field boundaries. The dead woman had been caught in the middle when Thorstein struck at his neighbor with an axe. The legal question was not murder, but property damage. The judgment required Thorstein to pay her replacement value 8 marks of silver for a woman of approximately 20 years who could weave. No additional punishment, no consideration of the life, ended simply a commercial transaction to compensate for destroyed property. Oisa had been captured in Ireland 5 years earlier. She had learned Norse adapted to Iceland's harsh climate and developed exceptional skill in weaving that made her valuable to her owner. She had even borne 2 children who now served in the same household. None of this mattered legally. Her death was recorded in the same manner as the loss of sheep in a storm, regrettable destruction of assets requiring financial compensation. The Graga's laws went further in their dehumanization. A fascinating and horrifying provision called the morning gift tradition allowed masters to lend female thralls to guests as hospitality gestures. Refusing such use was not legally possible. The woman became a temporary gift passed between men like cups of mead. Any children resulting from such arrangements automatically became the property of the woman's owner, regardless of the father's status. Ragnhild experienced this system when her master hosted a gathering of 5 chieftains to discuss a raiding alliance. For a week, she was passed among the guests nightly. By the meeting's end, she was pregnant. 9 months later, she gave birth to a son, whose father could have been any of 6 men. The child was nobody's son. Everybody's property, raised as a slave with no identity beyond his mother's servitude. The laws addressed every contingency of female slavery with disturbing thoroughness. If a thrall woman was injured by someone other than her owner, compensation went to the owner, not the injured woman. If she was permanently disabled, her value decreased, and the owner could seek the difference from whoever caused the damage. The woman's suffering was irrelevant. Only the economic impact on her owner mattered. Gudrun discovered this when a visiting trader assaulted her so violently she could no longer work. Her owner demanded compensation not for Gudrun's pain, but for the loss of her labor capacity. The trader paid 3 marks, the difference between a functional thrall and a damaged one. Gudrun received nothing except continued servitude in a body that would never fully heal. The inheritance laws created generational bondage that seemed impossible to escape. Children of thrall women were automatically thralls regardless of their father's status. Even if a free man acknowledged paternity, even if he wanted to claim the child, the law was absolute. The mother's status determined everything. Freedom could not be inherited through fathers. Slavery passed through mothers like a curse in the blood. This created situations of extraordinary cruelty. Free men might develop genuine affection for thrall women, might consider their children beloved, might want to grant freedom. The law forbade it without the owner's permission, which required purchasing both mother and children at full market value. Few could afford such expense. Many children grew up knowing their fathers seeing them daily, but remaining property that could be sold away at any moment. The legal system also created elaborate rules about sexual access that revealed the intersection of property law and human violation. An owner could use his female thralls without restriction. He could allow family members the same privilege. He could grant permission to guests. He could rent access for fees. But if someone used a female thrall without permission, it was not considered assault on the woman, but theft of services from the owner. The crime was economic, not moral. One provision seemed to offer mercy, but actually deepened cruelty. If a female thrall bore her master 3 children who survived to adulthood, she could theoretically earn freedom. But the conditions were nearly impossible. The children had to survive in a world where slave infant mortality exceeded 50%. They had to reach adulthood still alive and capable of work. The mother had to survive 3 pregnancies and remain valuable enough that her freedom wouldn't be an economic loss. Most importantly, the master had to honor an agreement he could revoke at any time. In 4 generations of detailed Icelandic records, fewer than a dozen women achieved freedom through this provision. Most died trying, their bodies worn out from repeated pregnancies while maintaining full work duties. Their children watched their mothers pursue impossible freedom through breeding, learning that their own existence was both their mother's hope and another link in their chains. But Viking law didn't just permit violations. It created something worse. Violations that became family traditions passed from father to son like inherited wealth. The wedding feast of Jarl Eric and Brianna took place in the same hall where her father's blood still stained the floor. 3 days had passed since Eric's warriors had broken through the gates of her family's Irish fortress. She had watched Eric personally separate her father's head from his body. Now she stood beside him, wearing her dead mother's wedding dress, the fabric still carrying her mother's scent. Eric's men made jokes about taming the Irish mare. They wagered on how long before she stopped fighting. Some gave her a week. Others who had seen this process before knew it would take months or years. The complete breaking of a noble woman required patience and systematic destruction of every source of identity and resistance. Brianna was 17. Until 3 days ago, she had been preparing for a strategic marriage to unite 2 Irish kingdoms against Norse expansion. She could read Latin, speak 3 languages, and managed her father's household accounts. Now she stood as living proof of Viking conquest, her marriage to Eric, legitimizing his claim to her family's lands. Every person in the hall understood the symbolism. The Irish nobility was being absorbed, literally consumed by Norse expansion. The systematic practice followed predictable patterns across the Viking world. Kill the men of fighting age, enslave the servants and common women. But the daughters of nobility faced a different fate. They became wives to their conquerors, their bodies serving as bridges between destroyed kingdoms and new Viking territories. These marriages were not unions, but absorptions designed to eliminate rival bloodlines while maintaining legal claims to conquered lands. Eric had killed Brianna's father, 2 brothers, and 6 male cousins in the battle for her family's fortress. He had personally executed her uncle, who surrendered after being promised mercy. Now he would father children on her children, who would carry her family's blood, but be raised as Vikings. Her Irish lineage would survive only as a whispered memory in Norse genealogies. The political logic was ruthlessly effective. By marrying noble daughters, Viking conquerors gained legitimate claims that pure conquest could never provide. Local populations might resist foreign invaders, but found it harder to resist the children of their own noble bloodlines, even when those children were raised to despise their maternal heritage. The women became biological weapons in a war of absorption that took generations to complete. 3 forced marriages from this period illustrate the pattern's horrifying consistency. In Scotland, the daughter of a defeated Mormaer was married to the Viking who had strangled her father with his bare hands. She bore him 4 sons, who grew up to lead raids against their mother's people. She lived 30 years as wife to her father's killer, raising children who celebrated their father's victory over their maternal grandfather. In Francia, a widow was forced to marry her husband's killer within a month of being widowed. The Viking leader needed her to maintain control over her late husband's estates. She had watched him die, trying to defend their home. Now she shared a bed with his killer, while her children from her first marriage were raised as thralls in their own former home. In Saxony, a princess was wed to the Viking who had burned her city. She had seen him order the execution of 300 citizens who refused to submit. At their wedding, he wore armor still marked with soot from the burning. Their children would grow up on stories of their father's glorious victory, never learning their mother had witnessed him massacre their grandparents. These marriages created children who embodied conquest. They looked like their defeated mothers, but thought like their Viking fathers. They spoke Norse, primarily learning their mothers' languages only as useful tools for managing subjected populations. They worshipped Norse gods, while their mothers secretly prayed to Christ. They represented successful cultural destruction, the erasure of one identity, and its replacement with another. The psychological warfare extended beyond the women themselves. Every person who had served Brianna's family now served Eric. They watched their former lord's daughter share meals with his killer. They saw her belly grow with the conqueror's child. They understood that resistance meant watching her suffer consequences. She became a hostage to their compliance. Her treatment depended on their submission. Some women found ways to resist within these impossible circumstances. They taught their children Irish stories disguised as Norse tales. They preserved genealogies in songs that seemed harmless. They maintained secret correspondence with surviving family members. They slowly poisoned their husbands with substances that mimicked natural illness. But most simply endured their spirits, breaking gradually, like stones worn down by water. One woman's successful revenge stands out in the historical record. Gudrun of the Hebrides married the Viking who killed her father and brothers. For 10 years, she played the role of beautiful wife, bearing 3 children, managing his household, earning his trust. She learned his habits, his weaknesses, his allergies. In the 10th year, she prepared a feast using mushrooms that she knew would kill him slowly. He died over 3 days, believing he had eaten spoiled food. She inherited his property as his widow, raising their children free from his presence. But Gudrun's revenge was exceptional. Most women discovered that death, even their tormentor's death, brought no freedom. Viking law and custom ensured that widows passed to brothers' sons or other male relatives. The system was designed to prevent escape through any means, including the death of husbands. These forced marriages created genealogical tangles that persist in DNA studies today. Modern Icelandic genetic research reveals that while the male lineage is predominantly Norse, the female lineage is heavily Celtic, primarily Irish and Scottish. These statistics represent thousands of Brianna's women whose bodies became the vessels through which Viking expansion achieved permanent genetic conquest. Death was her escape. Most women discovered there were fates designed to make even death impossible. The funeral preparation began 10 days before the chieftain's body would burn. On the banks of the Volga River, the Rus Vikings prepared for a ceremony that would demonstrate their wealth power and complete dominion over life and death. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan watched every detail, recording what he could bear to write, while implying horrors his ink refused to describe. The selection of the girl happened first. The chieftain's female slaves were gathered and asked who would follow their master into the afterlife. The word asked requires examination. These women understood that someone would be selected regardless. Volunteering meant controlling nothing except the illusion of choice. Refusing meant being selected anyway, but facing additional torments for reluctance. Sigrid stepped forward. She was 19, captured from a Slavic village 2 years earlier. She had learned enough Norse to understand that her survival value had been declining. Younger slaves had arrived. Her skills were common. Her beauty was fading under harsh treatment. Volunteering for death might have seemed like choosing her exit before worse fates arrived. Once selected, Sigrid entered a strange, suspended state between life and death. For 10 days, she would be treated as someone sacred and doomed simultaneously. She was given better food, strong drink that kept her intoxicated, but conscious new clothes that marked her as chosen for divine purpose. She was guarded constantly, never alone, never allowed the possibility of escape or self-harm that might disrupt the ceremony. Days 1 through 3 established the rhythm. Each morning, Sigrid was lifted onto a platform where she proclaimed seeing into the afterlife. "I see my master," she would call out, though her master's body lay preserved in a temporary shelter. "He summons me to his hall." The crowd would cheer these visions, interpreting them as confirmation that their chieftain awaited in Valhalla. The strong drink was crucial. It had to maintain Sigrid in a state where she could perform required functions, but couldn't fully grasp what was happening. The mixture, according to Norse sources, included fermented honey herbs that caused mild hallucinations and substances that prevented complete unconsciousness. She floated through the days in artificial euphoria, present, but not entirely there. Days 4 through 6 introduced the warriors. Each night, different men from the chieftain's inner circle would visit Sigrid's tent. This was presented as honor. These warriors sending messages to their dead leader through the woman who would soon join him. Ibn Fadlan describes the singing that accompanied these visits, loud enough to cover other sounds. He notes that 6 warriors participated over 3 nights, though his account becomes deliberately vague about specifics. What Ibn Fadlan implied, but wouldn't describe directly, can be understood through parallel accounts from other sources. The Byzantine chronicler Constantine Porphyrogenitus described similar ceremonies where the doomed woman became a vessel for the living to communicate with the dead through physical acts. The Frankish chronicler Adam of Bremen wrote about Swedish ceremonies where the sacrifice included shameful uses before death. Days 7 to 9 focused on preparation of the physical elements. The funeral ship was dragged ashore and filled with goods the chieftain would need in the afterlife: weapons, gold, horses, dogs, and finally the preserved body itself. A tent was erected on the ship's deck where the final ceremony would occur. Sigrid watched these preparations, understanding that each addition to the ship brought her death closer. The old woman called the Angel of Death appeared on day 7. She was a massive woman, broad and strong, with eyes that showed she had overseen many such ceremonies. She would be the one to ensure Sigrid's death when the time came. She prepared the implements: a rope for strangling, a broad blade for certainty herbs that would be burned to mask the smell of death. Her presence meant the ceremony had passed from preparation to inevitability. Day 9 brought rehearsals. Sigrid was taught exactly where to stand, what to say, how to move through the ceremony. She practiced drinking from the ceremonial cup. She rehearsed her final words. She was shown the tent where the last acts would occur. Everything was choreographed to ensure smooth execution of both ceremony and girl. The final day arrived with unusual clarity. The crowd gathered at dawn, hundreds of witnesses to confirm their chieftain's glorious departure. Sigrid was dressed in the finest clothes she had ever worn, gold arm rings that marked her as chosen, a cloak that had belonged to the chieftain himself. She was lifted onto the ship, where she performed the required rituals. She drank from 3 cups. The first she dedicated to her mother and father, the second to her dead relatives, the third to her master, waiting in the afterlife. Each cup contained more of the intoxicating mixture. By the third, she swayed visibly, held upright by 2 women who ensured she completed the ceremony. The tent ceremony came next. 6 warriors waited inside, the same 6 who had visited her tent on previous nights. Now in daylight, with hundreds watching the tense movements, they completed their final use of the woman who would carry their messages to Valhalla. Ibn Fadlan notes that each man upon emerging would call out that he had done this for love of his chieftain. When the 6th warrior emerged, the Angel of Death entered with her rope and blade. What happened next was hidden by tent walls, but the crowd could see shadows through the fabric. 2 women held Sigrid's hands. 2 men held her feet. The Angel of Death placed the rope around her neck, while another person pulled it tight. The strangling took several minutes. To ensure death, the broad blade was driven between her ribs. Sigrid's body was placed beside the chieftain on the funeral ship. Fire arrows ignited the oil-soaked wood. Within minutes, the entire ship blazed. The crowd cheered as smoke rose, carrying their chieftain and his slave to the afterlife. By sunset, only ashes and metal fittings remained. But Sigrid was one of thousands. Similar ceremonies occurred from Iceland to Russia, wherever Viking chieftains died wealthy enough to afford such spectacles. Adam of Bremen described witnessing a ceremony in Sweden where 5 women were burned with a king. Archaeological evidence from Norway confirms multiple female bodies in ship burials, their positions suggesting they did not die naturally. The religious justification wrapped brutality in sacred purpose. These women were not murdered, but transformed into eternal servants. They would serve in Valhalla as they had served in life. Forever bound to masters who owned them beyond death. The crowd celebrated these transformations as honors the greatest purpose a slave woman could achieve. At least funeral sacrifices ended quickly. The living sacrifices lasted decades. 7-year-old Astrid learned she was property on an ordinary morning when she tried to play with the blacksmith's daughter. The girl pushed her away, spitting words Astrid had heard, but not understood. Thrall brat. Her mother found her crying behind the grain storage and explained what should never need explaining to a child. They were not people. They were things that looked like people, but had no more rights than hammers or plows. Her mother's name was Ingrid, though she had been called Aoife in the Ireland of her birth. Captured at 15, bearing her first child at 16, she had produced 4 children for her master's household. Each child automatically inherited her status born into slavery through the simple fact of emerging from her body. The father's identity was irrelevant. Even if he was free, even if he was the master himself, the children remained property. Astrid would grow up watching her mother serve as what the Norse called a morning gift, lent to guests as casually as lending tools. She learned to recognize the particular expression her mother wore when returning from such nights blank as fresh snow present but absent. She watched her mother's body change through repeated pregnancies, each child removed as soon as they could work sold or redistributed according to the household's needs. The hereditary system created mathematical impossibilities of freedom. A female thrall's children were thralls. Their children would be thralls. The line continued until broken by death, or the impossibly rare manumission that required purchasing freedom at full market value. Most bloodlines that entered slavery in the 8th century remained enslaved in the 11th century. Multiple generations knowing nothing but servitude. 3 generations of women lived in one household in Iceland around 960. The grandmother captured in Scotland remembered freedom as a distant dream. The mother born in slavery knew freedom only as a concept. The granddaughter could not imagine freedom any more than she could imagine flying. Each generation related differently to their captivity, creating complex psychological dynamics within enslaved families. The grandmother clung to memories of Scotland, teaching her descendants words in a language they would never use in a land they would never see. She represented a living connection to freedom, reminding children that their bloodline had not always been property. Her stories of life before slavery seemed like fairy tales to grandchildren who had never seen anyone who looked like them live free. The mother occupied a middle space born into slavery, but raised by someone who remembered freedom. She understood conceptually what had been lost, but had no personal experience of it. Her identity formed entirely within slavery's constraints. She could not teach her children to be free because she had never learned it herself. She could only teach them to survive as slaves, passing down strategies for avoiding punishment, maintaining health despite harsh conditions, earning small privileges through compliance. The granddaughter knew nothing else. Slavery was not a condition, but an identity. She did not think of herself as a person who happened to be enslaved, but as a slave who happened to be person-shaped. The psychological damage went deeper than submission. It was complete internalization of property status, accepting at fundamental levels that she existed only as an extension of her owner's will. Children watched their mothers violated repeatedly, understanding this as normal, inevitable their own future. Daughters grew up knowing they would experience what their mothers experienced. Sons grew up knowing they could never protect their mothers or sisters or future daughters. The emotional damage compounded across generations, each child inheriting not just legal status but accumulated trauma. One family traced through sagas endured 5 generations of enslavement. The original woman captured from Francia bore 8 children. Her daughters bore 23 grandchildren. By the 5th generation, over 100 descendants lived in slavery across Iceland, Norway, and Denmark. An entire genetic line reduced to property, their potential contributions to art, science, leadership, or simple human happiness erased by inherited bondage. The psychological destruction manifested in specific behaviors that appeared across all long-term slave populations. Extreme conflict avoidance that went beyond prudence to pathological inability to assert any preference. Dissociation during violence that became permanent emotional numbness. Hypervigilance that prevented deep sleep or true rest. These adaptations helped individuals survive, but damaged them in ways that passed to their children through both behavior modeling and modern science suggests epigenetic changes from severe trauma. Some women attempted to break the cycle through infanticide, killing their newborns, rather than condemning them to slavery. Norse law treated this as property destruction, requiring compensation to owners not as desperate acts by mothers trying to spare their children inherited suffering. The sagas occasionally mention finding dead infants hidden in hay storage or weighted in streams, their mothers choosing grief over watching another generation enslaved. The sexual violence experienced by female thralls created complicated bloodlines. Many children never knew their fathers' identities. Others knew but could not acknowledge the free men who had fathered them. Some grew up seeing their fathers daily, perhaps even receiving occasional kindness, while remaining property that could be sold or traded. The psychological impact of knowing your father while being owned like livestock created identity fractures that never healed. Physical markers of slavery passed through generations. Malnutrition during pregnancy created children prone to specific health problems. Repetitive stress injuries from labor became heritable susceptibilities. The stunted growth from childhood labor meant each generation started smaller, weaker, more vulnerable. Bodies themselves became archives of accumulated suffering, each generation adding new chapters of damage. Language provided one of the few spaces for preservation of identity. Enslaved women taught their children words from homeland languages, songs from before capture stories that preserved fragments of free heritage. These linguistic treasures were hidden from masters, shared only in whispers maintained across generations, as proof that they had once been more than property. Some women discovered death wasn't even an escape when Vikings found ways to make them serve beyond the grave. Dawn at Hedeby brought the sound of chains before the sun cleared the horizon. The great slave market at this Danish trading center processed human beings with the efficiency of a modern distribution center. Women arrived on ships from Ireland, England, and Francia to the west. Others came overland from Slavic territories to the east. All converged here to be sorted, priced, and redistributed across the Viking world. The market operated with bureaucratic precision. Each woman received a number painted on her shoulder in woad that wouldn't wash off for weeks. Records were kept of origin, approximate age, observable skills, and physical condition. The Vikings had created comprehensive inventory management for human beings, centuries before such systems were applied to other goods. This morning, a coffle of 50 women had arrived from Ireland. They were connected by iron collars linked with chains, forcing them to move as a single organism. When one woman stumbled from exhaustion, the chain pulled at the necks of those before and behind her. They had learned over the journey to move in rhythm, to anticipate each other's steps, to become a single creature with 50 heads and 100 legs. The sorting began immediately. Women were separated by ethnicity, age, and apparent health. Irish women went to one pen Frankish to another, Slavic to a third. The segregation was practical. Different ethnic groups commanded different prices in different markets. Slavic women brought premium prices in southern markets. Irish women were preferred in Iceland. Frankish women commanded high prices from Byzantine traders. Within ethnic divisions came age sorting. Girls under 14 in one group, women 14 to 25 in another, 25 to 35 in a third, older women in a fourth. Each age range had specific market values and destinations. The youngest might be raised in households to be perfectly trained. The prime age women faced immediate sale for maximum value. Older women went to agricultural operations where their remaining labor could be extracted before disposal. The inspection process stripped away any remaining dignity. Buyers examined teeth to estimate age and health. They felt muscles to assess work capacity. They checked for pregnancy disease or injuries that might affect value. Women stood naked in lines while strangers evaluated them like livestock, discussing their bodies as merchandise. One coffle of 50 women demonstrates the trade's brutal logistics. They began their journey in Dublin, bound for Baghdad. The ship journey to Denmark took 5 days. 12 women were sold at Hedeby. The remaining 38 continued overland through Slavic territories. At each major trading post, a few more were sold or traded for supplies. By the time they reached Kiev, 23 remained. The river journey south claimed 3 more to disease. 20 reached Constantinople. Only 12 of the original 50 arrived in Baghdad. Each stage of the journey brought new horrors. Different crews of guards with different appetites. Different languages meaning inability to communicate needs or understand commands. Different climates requiring adaptation while chained and underfed. The women who survived to final destinations had endured transformations that left them barely recognizable as the people who had begun the journey. Specialized markets developed for specific types of women. Constantinople preferred educated women who could serve as scribes or tutors. The Byzantine Empire's elaborate bureaucracy created demand for literate slaves who could manage correspondence in multiple languages. A woman who could read and write Latin, Greek, and Arabic might bring 50 marks of silver. Baghdad's markets sought young women for the harems of wealthy merchants. Beauty standards were precise and culturally specific: pale skin red or blonde hair, blue eyes, features that seemed exotic in the Islamic world. These women faced particular fates, disappearing into private households where they might live decades without ever being seen by anyone except their owners and other slaves. Iceland's market demanded strong women capable of agricultural labor and textile production. The isolated island settlements needed women who could work fields, tend animals, spin thread, and weave cloth through long winters. Beauty was less valuable than endurance. A plain woman who could work 18-hour days brought higher prices than a beautiful woman who might break under harsh conditions. Sweden developed markets for women skilled in specific crafts. A woman who could work iron brought premium prices. One who understood brewing commanded high value. Those with medical knowledge were particularly prized. The Vikings recognized that certain skills multiplied value and actively sought women with specialized capabilities. The infrastructure supporting these markets was vast. Slave catchers operated like independent contractors, raiding isolated settlements to capture women and children for sale. Translators worked the markets, teaching basic Norse phrases to new captives or serving as intermediaries in negotiations. Doctors such as they were kept women alive through journeys, understanding that dead merchandise brought no profit. The financial instruments developed for slave trading prefigured modern commerce. Credit arrangements allowed buyers to purchase women with promised future payment. Insurance systems covered losses during transport. Investment partnerships pooled resources for large purchases. The Vikings created sophisticated financial mechanisms that would later be applied to other forms of trade. Some women were sold dozens of times, passing from owner to owner like coins changing hands. Each sale meant new violence, new adaptation, new destruction of any stability or identity they might have built. The constant movement was often deliberate, preventing women from forming connections or organizing resistance. A Welsh woman named Gwen was sold 17 times over 4 years. Each sale moved her farther from home, first to Ireland, then to Norway, then to Iceland, then to Greenland. By the time she reached the edges of the known world, she had forgotten the sound of Welsh. She could communicate in broken phrases from 6 languages, but was fluent in none. Her identity had been erased through constant displacement, but the worst fate wasn't being sold once. It was being valuable enough to be sold again and again. The escaped thrall named Ursa reached Iceland's northern coast after 3 days of running. Her feet were destroyed from crossing lava fields. Her hands were torn from climbing through volcanic rock. But she had made it to the ocean, to what she thought would be freedom. Then she understood the geography of her prison. Water stretched endlessly in every direction. No ships waited. No other land was visible. Even if she could steal a boat, she didn't know which direction to sail. The nearest land was Greenland itself, another frozen prison. Beyond that, nothing but ocean until Norway, which she could never reach in a small boat. Freedom was geographically impossible. Her recapture took 2 days. Iceland's settlement pattern meant escape was always temporary. There were no forests to hide in permanently, no neighboring kingdoms to reach, no communities that would harbor fugitives. Every person on the island knew every other person or knew someone who did. A strange woman traveling alone was immediately obvious as an escaped slave. When they brought Ursa back, her punishment was precisely calculated. Not death, which would waste her value, not mutilation that would prevent work. Instead, they hobbled her cutting tendons in her heels that would heal wrong, allowing her to work, but never run again. She would spend her remaining years moving in a shuffling gait that marked her as someone who had tried to escape and learned the impossibility of it. The island slavery of Iceland and Greenland created unique psychological horrors. In continental territories, slaves could at least imagine escape. They could dream of reaching free lands, finding communities that might accept them, disappearing into populations where they might blend. Island slaves faced the certainty that escape meant only death by ocean volcano or ice. Iceland's settlement began in 874, and from the beginning, slaves comprised a significant portion of the population. The free settlers needed massive labor to create viable farms from volcanic soil. They brought thralls from Norway and captured more from raids on Scotland and Ireland. These slaves faced a landscape that seemed designed by gods to prevent escape. The interior was uninhabitable volcanic desert. The coasts were rocky cliffs beaten by violent seas. Between settlements stretched miles of rough terrain that would kill unprepared travelers. Summer brought continuous daylight that made concealment impossible. Winter brought darkness and cold that killed in hours. The island itself was a prison more secure than any walls could create. A mass escape attempt in 9 to 12 ended in complete disaster. 23 slaves from various farms coordinated their flight planning to steal boats and attempt to reach Scotland. They made it to the coast, even managed to steal 2 small fishing boats, but they had no knowledge of ocean navigation. Both boats were found weeks later washed up on Iceland's southern shore. All 23 had died at sea. Their bodies never recovered. Some women chose volcanic death over recapture. The island's active geology provided one form of escape that couldn't be prevented. Women would throw themselves into hot springs that boiled them alive. Others walked into lava flows, choosing instant incineration over continued enslavement. The volcano Hekla was known as a site where desperate slaves ended their lives in fire rather than live in chains. The psychological impact of geographic hopelessness created specific behavioral patterns. Island slaves showed higher rates of complete dissociation, simply shutting down mentally while their bodies continued working. They developed elaborate fantasy worlds, creating internal escapes when external escape was impossible. Some became catatonic, functioning physically, but ceasing to respond to anything beyond direct commands. Greenland's isolation was even more complete. The 2 small settlements there required massive labor to survive in the harsh environment, but escape meant certain death in a landscape of ice and stone. The ocean journey to anywhere else took weeks in large ships. Small boats or individual escape attempts were suicide. The land itself provided no sustenance for fugitives. Death would come from cold starvation or polar bears long before any possibility of freedom. Women in Greenland faced additional horrors from the gender imbalance. Free male settlers outnumbered free women 5 to 1. Female slaves became communal property in ways that even exceeded the violations common in Iceland. They were passed between men nightly shared, like tools or food, their bodies becoming resources for entire communities rather than individual owners. The complete social dissolution in Greenland created circumstances where even minimal Norse law ceased to function. No assemblies were held regularly. No law speakers maintained legal tradition. The settlements operated on pure force, with female slaves at the absolute bottom of hierarchies maintained only through violence. Women could be killed for any reason or no reason, their deaths unrecorded and unmourned. Some women attempted long-term resistance through work slowdowns or sabotage, but the small populations meant such resistance was immediately obvious. There was no anonymity in communities of a few hundred people. Every action was seen. Every resistance was known. Punishment was instant, and public serving as education for others considering similar acts. The multi-year resistance attempt by a group of Irish women in Iceland demonstrated both courage and futility. They coordinated across 3 farms, slowly poisoning their masters with small doses of local plants that caused illness, but not immediate death. The plan was to weaken the free population enough that slaves could take control. The conspiracy lasted 2 years before discovery. All 15 women involved were burned alive in a single mass execution that served as warning to slaves across the island. Geography made escape impossible, but Viking creativity made even submission deadly. A Saxon village watched Vikings approach across morning fields. The year was 866. Every family faced the same calculation that dozens of villages had faced before them. Fight and watch their women suffer spectacularly or flee immediately, and perhaps spare them the worst. They fled. Within an hour, the entire population was moving south, abandoning homes their families had inhabited for generations. They left food in storehouses, tools, and workshops, everything except what they could carry. The Vikings found a ghost town, wealth without resistance, victory without battle. The terror weapon had worked perfectly. The weapon was not sword or axe, but reputation. Stories from other villages had spread faster than Viking ships could sail. Everyone knew what happened to women in defeated settlements, the public violations, the selection processes, the slavery that followed. These stories deliberately spread, and probably embellished, created mass evacuations before Vikings arrived. The mathematics of terror were precisely calculated. One brutalized woman created stories that spread through kinship networks, trade connections, and religious gatherings. Those stories reached hundreds of other women, who then influenced their families' decisions when Vikings appeared. A single spectacular atrocity could clear entire regions without actual combat. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 used this psychological warfare systematically. After capturing York, they didn't immediately advance. Instead, they held the city while stories of what happened to York's women spread across Northumbria. When they finally marched, they found minimal resistance. Populations had already fled rather than risk their women facing York's fate. Ivar the Boneless, one of the army's leaders, understood the propaganda value of female captives. He would parade captured noblewomen through territories he intended to conquer, displaying them in conditions that communicated what awaited resistance. These women, still alive, but obviously broken, were more effective than threats or negotiations. They were living warnings that traveled with the army. The Normandy raids demonstrated how efficiently terror through women's bodies could empty entire regions. After Vikings publicly violated the Count of Rohan's wife and daughters, neighboring territories experienced mass emigration. Families abandoned productive farms rather than risk similar fates. The economic disruption from fleeing populations exceeded what Vikings could have achieved through direct destruction. Chronicles from the period described the speed of terror transmission. A monastery attacked on Monday would generate stories reaching settlements 50 miles away by Thursday. Families would be moving by Friday. By the following Monday, Vikings would find abandoned villages ready for easy plunder. The efficiency exceeded any military campaign dependent on actual combat. The deliberate strategies included timing attacks for maximum psychological impact. Raiders would strike during harvest festivals when communities gathered, ensuring maximum witnesses to atrocities. They would target religious celebrations, violating women in churches to combine spiritual and physical horror. They would choose market days when traders would carry stories to distant communities. Forcing male relatives to watch was standard practice. Husbands watched wives violated. Fathers watched daughters taken. Brothers watched sisters selected for slavery. The psychological destruction of men through witnessing female family members suffering created broken populations incapable of resistance. These men would spread stories of their own helplessness, encouraging others to flee rather than face similar impotence. The stories spread with specific details that amplified terror. Not just that women were taken, but how they were sorted. Not just that they were enslaved, but the specific fates awaiting different categories. The precision of the horror, the organizational efficiency of the suffering, made it seem inescapable. Resistance appeared futile when the enemy had industrialized brutality. Some Saxon chronicles suggest that Vikings deliberately released certain captives to spread stories. Women who had witnessed but not experienced the worst violations were freed to carry warnings to other settlements. They became unwitting propaganda tools, their testimony more credible than Viking threats because they had seen the reality. The multiplication effect meant that Vikings could conquer through reputation more than combat. For every settlement actually attacked, 3 others might evacuate based on stories. For every woman actually enslaved, dozens of others would flee potential enslavement. The terror weapon turned Viking raids from local disasters into regional evacuations. The economic benefits were substantial. Abandoned settlements could be plundered without resistance. Fleeing populations left behind everything too heavy to carry. Vikings gained wealth without risking warriors in combat. The psychological warfare made conquest profitable with minimal actual fighting. Religious communities were particularly vulnerable to terror tactics. Monasteries and convents that received refugees would hear detailed accounts of atrocities. These stories would be recorded in chronicles, spreading through religious networks that reached across kingdoms. A single attack on a religious community could generate terror throughout entire Christian networks. But some women found ways to resist that terrified even Vikings. The midnight poisoning in Jarl Hakon's hall left 12 warriors dead at dawn. They were discovered in grotesque positions, foam dried on their lips, their faces frozen in final agony. The Irish thrall, Deirdre, stood among the bodies, making no attempt to hide or escape. When they seized her, she said simply, "Worth it." She had been captured 3 years earlier when Vikings raided her family's farm near Cork. She had watched them kill her husband and eldest son. Her younger children had been taken for slavery, dispersed to different settlements. She had been brought to Hakon's hall as a brewing specialist, her knowledge of herbs and fermentation making her valuable for producing mead. That same knowledge had provided her weapon. She knew which mushrooms common in Norwegian forests would cause devastating death if prepared correctly. She had been gathering them for months, drying them, grinding them into powder indistinguishable from common spices. She waited for the victory celebration when the warriors would drink heavily, when one more ingredient in the mead would go unnoticed. Her execution took 3 days. They broke her on the wheel, taking special care to prolong her suffering. But witnesses noted she never screamed, never begged, never showed regret. She spoke only once more, asking if all 12 were dead. When told yes, she smiled. That smile haunted the survivors more than her victims' deaths. Deirdre was not unique. Across the Viking world, enslaved women found ways to resist that ranged from subtle sabotage to spectacular violence. Most paid with their lives, but their resistance, however futile it seemed, created complications for Viking slavery systems that required constant vigilance against the very women they had subjugated. Poison was the most common tool of resistance. Women who prepared food had access to kitchens, gardens, and brewing supplies. They learned which local plants caused illness versus death. Some engaged in slow poisoning that appeared to be natural disease. Others, like Deirdre, chose mass casualty events that sent messages even though they guaranteed their own deaths. A Welsh woman named Saras killed 3 masters over 5 years before being caught. Each death appeared natural. The first seemed to die of food poisoning, the second of a wasting disease, the third of sudden heart failure. Only when the fourth master grew suspicious and had his food tested did they discover she had been using small doses of mercury available from metalwork to slowly poison each owner. Her knowledge came from her father, who had been a healer before Vikings killed him. Arson provided another avenue for resistance. A Frankish group of thralls coordinated the burning of Hedebe's slave market in 943. They had gathered lamp oil, slowly hiding it in various locations. On a night when strong winds blew from the west, they set fires simultaneously at 6 points around the market. The conflagration destroyed not just the slave pens, but significant portions of the trading post. 17 of the 20 women involved died in the flames they set, choosing immolation over recapture. Infanticide devastating to mothers, but seen as mercy compared to condemning children to slavery, occurred regularly. Women would smother newborns or abandon them in forests, choosing grief over watching another generation enslaved. Norse law treated this as property destruction, but no punishment could be worse than what drove mothers to kill their own children. Information warfare became a subtle but effective resistance. Women who learned Norse could spy on their masters, passing intelligence to other slaves or even to enemies of their captors. A Saxon woman named Elfwin spent 7 years pretending to understand less Norse than she actually knew, gathering information that she eventually passed to English forces planning resistance against Viking expansion. Some women seduced Viking men specifically to kill them. They would earn trust through apparent submission, gain access to private spaces, then strike when victims were most vulnerable. A Slavic woman named Ruja killed 5 Viking leaders over 3 years by becoming their concubine, waiting until they trusted her completely, then cutting their throats while they slept. Suicide pacts among captured women prevented Vikings from obtaining expected value from raids. Entire groups would agree to kill themselves rather than serve as slaves. Mass drownings, deliberate starvation, or collective poisonings would destroy the economic value of raids. Vikings sometimes found themselves with ships full of corpses rather than valuable slaves. Religious resistance took forms Vikings found particularly disturbing. Christian women would engage in extreme fasting that destroyed their health and value. They would deliberately disfigure themselves to reduce their worth. Some would enter catatonic states through intensive prayer, becoming living corpses that couldn't work or serve any purpose. Physical resistance, though usually futile, occasionally succeeded. A group of Irish women overpowered their guards during transport, killed them with their own weapons, and sailed the ship back to Ireland. Most couldn't navigate and died at sea, but 3 ships are recorded as having been successfully returned by escaped slaves who had learned basic sailing from watching their captors. Long-term resistance through cultural preservation also threatened Viking domination. Women would secretly teach their children Christianity, Irish law, Saxon customs, or other traditions from their homelands. They maintained languages Vikings had tried to erase. They preserved genealogies that Vikings wanted forgotten. This cultural resistance created identity conflicts in children who were supposed to be fully assimilated Vikings. The price for any resistance was severe. The blood eagle execution, where ribs were broken outward to resemble wings and lungs pulled out to flutter like wings,